Welcome back to part 2 of our first kind of week of the Open Dialogue Life Group. In this section, we're going to talk about what I kind of call keeping it cool. In part 1, we talked about the art of apology and how it is that we apologize and need to apologize. But really, what I want to focus on here is kind of the one thing that no matter what will basically always shut down having a meaningful conversation. And when it comes to especially having different opinions in a conversation, there is always one thing that is going to shut down understanding and compromise. And that is trying to prove that you're right. No matter what conversation you're having, when your sole focus is on trying to prove yourself right, it is going to shut down understanding and compromise. And again, when we enter into a conversation, just a normal conversation, the idea is that we're having a dialogue, right? A dialogue and a conversation is when there's two people talking and you're trying to get a better understanding of whatever it is that you're talking about. And when I say better understanding, it could be a better understanding of what the person believes, it could be a better understanding of the subject, it could be maybe a better understanding of a different perception or a different view on a typical subject. But the idea is that when we enter into a dialogue, there is a purpose. When I sit down and I talk to my wife about how her day was, the purpose of that conversation is for me to get an understanding of what she went through that day. How was Tristan? How were some of the goals that she had set to work? How was writing her book? How was maybe cleaning if she decided to clean? And likewise, in that conversation, if Olivia asks me how my day was, I know that she's asking, how was working at church? How was working for your life group? How was doing this? If it's Saturday and, I've been cleaning in the morning, she'll ask, how was your morning? Did you enjoy mopping? Did you enjoy doing the dishes? Did you enjoy things like that? And so the point of that conversation is for us to understand how each other went about their day, how their day was. Was it a hard day? Was it a good day? So that way I can be informed about how she's feeling, right? And so when we enter into a conversation, when we enter into a dialogue, it's to get understanding of what is happening. And maybe if it's like a debate or if it's something, like if we're talking about how we want to spend our money, Olivia and I always set a budget for each month. And while it relatively remains the same, sometimes there's a little wiggle room for money, and so we'll have a discussion about that, and there might be a compromise, right? Well, I think we should spend the money here, you think we should spend the money there. Where exactly is it going to go? And so the number one thing that will always shut down a dialogue and will always shut down a conversation is when you're trying to prove yourself right. And I'm not saying that when we enter into a dialogue or when we enter into a discussion, we shouldn't try to prove our perspective. We shouldn't help inform. But if our sole focus is on trying to prove ourselves right, we're no longer having a conversation, we're having a debate, right? A conversation is for understanding and for trying to reach, compromise in a thing. A debate is when you're trying to prove your point. When you're trying to prove I am right. If you think about, debates in movies, or if you were ever to watch a debate, there's side A and there's side B. And they each have a point, and the point that they're trying to prove is what the debate is over. So if side A's point, and I'm just going to choose a theological point because I've been to debates like this, is God exists, and point B is God does not exist. So person arguing point A is going to put a case forward of why God exists. And the winner who makes the point or who convinces you at the end of the night is the winner. That is a debate. In a debate, you are trying to prove your point. And the number one thing that will always shut down conversations is when you're no longer discussing for understanding and compromise, but you're trying to prove your point. It will always shut down conversations. A debate is when you're trying to have a judgment, when you're trying to say, look, I want you to say that I'm right. And let me tell you something, there are more debates happening than there are conversations. My dad and I often will sit down over coffee and we'll have a debate. But there are some times when I talk with my dad where I just want to have a conversation. And the conversation gets lost because we start debating different ideas. And we have to understand that in a conversation, when we try to prove ourselves right, it will always shut down a conversation because we're moving from talking to someone to now debating with that person. And so, going along with that, there's a few things that we can do. There's a few things that we can do to make sure that a conversation stays, I'll say a conversation. That it stays civil. And these are just, so these are some things. I'm not going to say they're necessarily connected to having a debate. But if we want to have a successful conversation, there's a few things we can do. And the first thing we can do is we need to remember that few people ever view themselves as being in the wrong. Take a moment to think about that. Few people ever view themselves as being in the wrong. When I enter into a conversation, the person that I'm talking to, and even myself, very rarely ever will view themselves as being wrong. In Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, he talks to an inmate who murdered his wife. And in the interview for the newspaper, he felt that what he was doing was right. That his wife was suffering and that everything, was going wrong. And so by murdering her, he was kind of freeing her from all the suffering and everything that was going wrong. He didn't view that he was wrong. Al Capone, being interviewed, did not think that he was wrong in smuggling alcohol and in selling drugs. He thought that what he was doing was simply allowing people to enjoy their life to the fullest. Al Capone, a known American gangster who was most wanted, who did horrible things, mob leader, and yet he didn't view himself as wrong. He viewed himself as helping people live their life to the best. Think about times when you've done something. Do you go into it thinking, oh man, I am totally wrong in doing this, but I'm going to do it anyways? See, a lot of times, what we're doing, we feel is right. And so when we enter into a conversation, if we remember that, okay, the person is saying this, and they might be morally wrong, they might be breaking the law, but the thing is that they're not perceiving that they're wrong. They don't think that they're wrong. And we have to remember that because that will help shape how it is that we talk to them. And I'm not saying that we can't try and show them, right? As a Christian, that doesn't mean that, we don't try to tell them truth and we don't try to, in love, direct them to what God would have them to do and what Christ would have them to do and what the law says. But we need to remember that their perspective is not necessarily that they're wrong. And so this is about the point where we're starting. It's about where we're going to take the conversation. Because if we start off with the conversation with, oh, they know what they're doing is wrong, that's not necessarily correct. There's a type of evangelism called the way of the master, and it said, and in it, the person who kind of wrote it says, you need to start with convincing someone that they're a sinner. And the same is true in a conversation, and we don't want to debate with them. Remember, the point of a conversation is understanding and compromise. But what we need to realize is that if they don't think they're wrong, we're starting at two different points, right? And what happens when we start at two different points a lot of times is we're either going to butt heads and we're going to debate, or what we're talking about is going to completely miss each other. And so we have to remember, they don't think they're wrong. And so if they don't think they're wrong, how can I enter into this conversation? How exactly can I say things to them to help them understand, to help them, the point that I'm having, right? To help fill them in. The second thing is that we should never criticize someone. If you want to talk about something that is immediately going to rub or going to butt heads with someone, it's when we criticize. We have to learn and we have to take criticism out of our vocabulary. I love what Charles Schwab said. He says, I have yet to find a man Whoever great or exalted in his situation, who did not do better work and put forth greater effort under a spirit of approval than he ever would have under a spirit of criticism. I have never seen, no matter how successful he is, a man put in more effort under a spirit of criticism than he did under a spirit of approval. If you're a boss or an employee, or if you want your kids to do something, a spirit of approval. And I'm not saying, you have to be, always say yes, or, never say no, or never discipline or anything. But it's this idea of approving. It's this idea of not taking an opportunity where you could criticize to criticize. Abraham Lincoln, one of the most successful things he did was he never criticized. After losing a huge battle, the Battle of Gettysburg, and it really wasn't a loss, it was a victory, but he wrote to his general, and he was very upset because he kept telling his general, press the attack, this is it, we could end the war, we could end the Civil War, and his general didn't do it. And he was furious, and he wrote a letter, and then he ripped it up. And no one saw what was in that letter. Most likely it was fuming, most likely, he would have fired him. But what he wrote after that was, I can't imagine what it was like on that battlefield having just lost several thousand soldiers. I can't imagine having not been there the decisions that you have to be making. He had perfect opportunity to criticize the general that was leading. But instead of criticizing, he showed sympathy. He sympathized. And if you want to talk about something that will immediately put people against us, that will immediately have people kind of like on the offensive, it's when we start to criticize. It's when we start to criticize. And so we have to come and enter into dialogue knowing that we're not criticizing someone. And this means changing the way that we discuss. This means changing the way that we talk. So not saying things like, well, that's not actually the way that it says. Or, you're actually wrong about that. Or instead saying, that's very interesting. Could you tell me a little bit more about that? I didn't know that it said that. Could you please tell me where it says that? And so it's about changing how it is that we respond. And very often we'll be like, and I'm just going to use Black Lives Matter, right? Because it's kind of in the news still and whatnot. Not all black people are treated like that. Or, there's a lot of successful people. And so we're criticizing, right? That is language of criticizing. And so what we want to do is say, that's interesting. I didn't know that people were suffering. Could you give me a reference? Or could you show me this? Could you inform me a little bit more? I didn't understand, right? And so when we take it on us, instead of criticizing a situation, we can continue to have a dialogue. We can continue to have an exchanging of understanding. And this is very hard to do. This is not something you can just do overnight. It's something that we have to intentionally be thinking about. We have to intentionally be thinking, is what I'm about to say, are the words that are about to come out of my mouth going to come across as me criticizing? Or am I phrasing it in a way that helps people understand, or it helps convey that I need a little bit more understanding? And that doesn't necessarily mean that you agree. Again, we don't always have to agree, but if we want to have a conversation, we have to have if we're having a conversation, we should be deepening in our understanding. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more next week. And so one of the things that we can do is we need to learn to not criticize. We need to learn to change our language and change our lingo. And the other thing is that we need to compliment more. Do you know, statistically, for every one negative thing that is said to a person in a day, it takes 10 positive things. So when you say you're stupid, or when you say you're horrible, or you suck at this job, it will take 10 positive things just to bring that person from that one negative thing that's said. We have to learn to compliment more. And this goes along with criticizing. This is why we shouldn't criticize. If you want to change the way you are as a leader, if you want to change the way that your marriage is, focus on not criticizing, but instead changing your language. I'm so sorry that, I'm so sorry that you've had a rough day. Could you tell me a little bit more about it? Don't criticize. Well, you were really snippy. sweetie, I'm sorry that I upset you. How is it that I can help you? Right? Change the language. Change, and you're like, well, it's not my fault. Well, it might not be your fault, but guess what? We can help. We can help. And so this is about changing our language in a way that we are not criticizing, but we're sympathizing. To sympathize, to be able to understand, and give more compliments. And so when it comes to having a dialogue, when it comes to having a conversation, we need to understand that conversation is always about deepening understanding or coming up to a place where there is a compromise. And the one thing that is going to shut it down is when we try to prove ourselves right. We need to remember that very few times when we're entering into a conversation and it's about the starting point, very few people view themselves as being in the wrong. And if we understand that, that will change the starting point that we have for entering into the conversation. We need to not criticize, but instead sympathize with people. And we have to offer more compliments. And I guarantee you, if you do these 4 things, don't prove yourself, don't try to just prove yourself right. And we'll talk about debating and we'll talk about conversations like that later on. Remember where someone very rarely views themselves as being wrong. Don't criticize, sympathize, and offer compliments. If you start doing these 4 things, I guarantee you that your conversations are going to change. I guarantee you. And where apologizing is a little bit easier to change, because we have to remember this is difficult, especially the criticizing one. And so I would encourage you in this upcoming week to try and think, is what I'm saying a criticism when it comes out of my mouth, or can I phrase it in a way that it comes across as I want to know more, or that's interesting, or could you tell me more, or in some way phrasing it like that. And remembering this person doesn't think they're wrong, and that will change the way that you enter into the conversation. Again, I pray and I hope that you have found this interesting. We're going to go into part 3, which I'm actually super excited about, and I pray that you continue, and I hope that you continue to join us. God bless, and I hope you have a great day.